In the modern city, amidst the towering buildings and the noise of the bustling metropolis, in a small church on the corner of the street, sat a little girl named Liza. She was 8 years old, with bright eyes that radiated curiosity, and she quietly gazed at the face of the priest who was reading a prayer. Today, the church was particularly full of people, but, importantly, Liza was not just a regular child attending the service. In her heart, there was a great curiosity about the world and about God Himself. After the service, Liza stayed a few minutes longer, trying for the first time to feel the peace that often filled these walls. She approached the large wooden doors of the church and saw an old man standing nearby, as if waiting for something. Liza realized he was waiting for her. "Good day," Liza said, slightly shy, but still addressing him. The man turned, and Liza was surprised to see that it was none other than Morgan Freeman. He smiled at her with a warm smile that seemed to dissolve all the turmoil in her heart. Liza felt that this was not just a movie star, but someone special who took her question seriously. "Hello, little one. What troubles you?" he asked, standing before her like a quiet elder, ready to listen. Liza hesitated for a moment, her hands clasped together, and she took a deep breath, trying to say what had been troubling her heart. "I don't understand," she began. "What does God mean to you? How do we know He exists?" Morgan Freeman looked at her, and in his eyes, one could see the same peace that always accompanied him on screen. He sat beside her, allowing the little girl to feel his support, and began a conversation that seemed endless for someone like her. "You know, Liza," he began, "God can mean something different to each of us. But I've always thought that it's not about how to see Him, but about how you feel Him in your heart. He's in everything, in good deeds, in the love we give to one another, and in the silence we hear when we stop and listen." Liza looked up at him, her heart filling with a feeling she couldn't describe in words. For the first time, she understood that everyone has their own path, and that God is not something to be simply understood logically, but something that can be felt and lived. They sat in silence for a few minutes when Liza said, "I understand now. God is what we carry inside and what we can share with others." Morgan smiled once more, and his words felt like a blessing for the little girl, who no longer sought answers in logic or science, but only in her heart. "Are you ready to share that with others?" he asked, ready to take her to a new level of understanding of the world. Liza nodded slowly, her small hands still clasped tightly together. She wasn't sure what she expected to feel, but somehow, what Morgan Freeman said made sense. It felt right. There was something peaceful about it, something that calmed the constant whirlwind of thoughts she always had. Morgan Freeman, with his wise eyes and calm demeanor, watched her for a moment longer before speaking again. "You know, Liza," he began, his voice steady, "sometimes the hardest part isn't believing in something so big and so far away. It's about finding meaning in the little things we do every day. Kindness, compassion, a helping hand when someone falls. These are ways we can show what we believe." Liza glanced down at her shoes, trying to understand the depth of his words. She was just a little girl, after all. But something about it felt like a secret she could carry with her, a secret she could share with others when the time came. "Do you think," she hesitated, "that people like me, people who don't always know what to say, can help too?" Morgan smiled, a genuine smile that seemed to touch every wrinkle in his face. "Absolutely. Sometimes, the simplest things are the most powerful. You don't need to be grown up or have all the answers. You just need to be kind, and people will notice. They'll understand that you care." Liza's heart swelled with a feeling she couldn't quite put into words. The idea that something so simple could make a difference felt like the key to something bigger than herself. It was as if she could hear the soft hum of possibility echoing in her chest. But what about when people are mean? Or when they don't listen? What if they don't care? Her voice faltered slightly, the weight of real-world problems creeping in. She knew, even at her age, that not everyone was as kind or understanding as she wanted them to be. Morgan looked at her thoughtfully. The sun outside had shifted, casting soft golden light through the stained glass windows, creating patches of colorful light on the stone floor. It was as if the church itself was holding its breath, waiting for the right answer. "People are complicated," he said gently. "Sometimes they act out of fear or pain or frustration. But that doesn't mean we have to react in the same way. The real challenge is showing them another way, even when it's hard. It might not always change things right away, but little by little, kindness can open hearts." Liza sat quietly for a moment, absorbing his words, feeling the weight of them settle into her chest. "So, even if people are mean, we can still choose how we respond." "Exactly," Morgan said with a nod. "You get to decide what kind of person you want to be. And sometimes by showing patience, understanding, or just a little bit of kindness, you might just change someone's day. Or maybe even their life." The sounds of the city outside filtered in, but inside, there was a sense of stillness that seemed to belong only to the moment they were sharing. Liza felt a sense of peace, something deeper than before, as if a door had opened inside her, a door she didn't even know existed. As they stood up, ready to leave the church, Morgan placed a hand on her shoulder. "Remember, the world isn't always kind. But you have the power to be the change you want to see in it. Even small actions matter." Liza nodded, her face a mixture of determination and curiosity. "I'll remember," she said, her voice small but firm. "I'll try to be kind, even when it's hard." Morgan smiled, his eyes gleaming with quiet pride. "That's all anyone can do." As they walked out of the church, the sun had fully set, and the streets were lit with a soft glow of streetlights. Liza felt a warmth she hadn't expected. The world seemed a little less scary, a little more hopeful. And though she knew she was just a little girl, she also knew that kindness, small, simple, and steady, was a power she could wield. The rest of the world would have to wait. For now, Liza had learned something more valuable than any answer. She had learned the power of choice, and how one small, kind step could begin to change everything. And somewhere deep inside, she believed that maybe, just maybe, kindness could change the world. As the days passed, Liza couldn't stop thinking about her conversation with Morgan Freeman. It wasn't just the words that stayed with her. It was the feeling behind them. A kind of quiet strength that came not from grand gestures, but from the small acts of everyday life. She started noticing things more, the way her mother smiled at the neighbors, even when they didn't always return the warmth. How the elderly man at the corner store always made sure she had enough change, even when his hands shook slightly from age. Liza began to understand that kindness wasn't just about being nice. It was about resilience, about showing up when it was hard, about offering something even when it felt like you didn't have much left to give. It wasn't always easy, but she realized it was always worth it. One afternoon, as she sat on the porch, watching the world go by, she overheard a conversation between her parents. They didn't know she was listening, but their words were too clear, too heavy to ignore. "I don't know if we can keep doing this," her mother said, her voice tight with worry. "Bills are piling up, the house needs repairs, and now they're saying taxes are going up again." "I know," her father replied, a note of defeat in his voice. "It's like we're running on empty, but no matter how hard we work, we're always behind." Liza's heart sank as she listened to them, realizing just how much they were carrying. She wanted to do something to help. But what could she do? She was just a little girl, after all. The world outside seemed so big, so full of problems that were beyond her understanding. But then she remembered Morgan's words. "You don't have to change everything. Just be kind. It's the small things that add up." The next day, Liza decided to do something simple but meaningful. She had noticed the neighbors across the street had been struggling. Their car was always parked out front, the tires looking worn and the engine sounding tired. Mr. and Mrs. Wheeler were in their 60s, always quiet, always polite, but there was a certain sadness in their eyes that Liza couldn't shake. She thought they might be lonely, but she wasn't sure. Liza went to her mother's kitchen and pulled out some cookies she'd baked with her. She carefully packed them in a small box, tying it with a ribbon she had found in her room. Her hands shook slightly as she walked across the street, the box feeling heavier than it should. When she rang the doorbell, Mr. Wheeler answered. His face creased with years of hard work, but a kind smile tugged at the corners of his lips. "Liza, what a surprise," he said, his voice warm but tired. "What brings you over here today?" I made cookies," Liza said, holding the box out to him. "I thought maybe you'd like some." Mr. Wheeler looked down at the box, then back up at Liza. His eyes softened, and for a moment she saw something she hadn't expected, gratitude. Yes, but also a kind of relief. "Well, that's very sweet of you, Liza," he said, crouching down to her level. "Thank you. You don't know how much this means." As he took the box, Liza's heart felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from her chest. The simple act of giving, of sharing something she'd made with her own hands, had changed the course of their day. It was a small gesture, but in that moment it felt like a bridge. A connection between two people who might not have spoken for days, maybe even weeks. Later that evening, when Liza returned home, she overheard another conversation between her parents. This time, the tone was different. "Did you see what Liza did today?" her mother asked. "She took cookies over to the Wheelers." Her father chuckled softly. "You know, sometimes it's the little things that make the biggest difference. I think she might be onto something." Liza felt a sense of pride swell inside her. She hadn't solved all their problems, but she had done something that made a difference, even if it was small. And then she remembered the words of Morgan Freeman once more. Sometimes the hardest part isn't believing in something so big and so far away. It's about finding meaning in the little things we do every day. Liza knew she wasn't going to change the world in a single day. But maybe, just maybe, if she kept choosing kindness, if she kept showing up for people, she could help make it just a little bit better. The next morning, as Liza walked past the window, she saw the Wheelers sitting on their porch, smiling at one another, a quiet peace hanging between them. The small, simple act of kindness had created a ripple, one that wasn't about grand gestures, but about the quiet, steady force of understanding and compassion. And for the first time, Liza felt a quiet, unwavering hope that the world, her small corner of it at least, could be changed not by force, but by a series of small, brave choices. Maybe that was all it took to begin. A small step, with kindness as the guide. And as she looked out the window, she realized that sometimes the smallest moments carried the biggest weight. And those were the ones that could shift everything, one person at a time. As the days passed, the weight of Liza's small kindness lingered in her mind, but something was changing in the air. The neighborhood, once peaceful and calm, had started to feel different, edgy, almost tense. It was subtle at first, but Liza could sense it. The quiet exchanges between neighbors began to fade. People who once greeted each other with smiles now avoided eye contact, hurried past each other without a word. Even the birds seemed to be less lively, their songs drowned out by the heavy silence hanging over the streets. Liza tried to ignore it, to hold on to the peace she felt when helping others. But it was hard. One evening, as she sat on the porch, she overheard a conversation that froze her in place. Her parents were arguing again. It wasn't just the normal bickering over bills or chores. It was something darker, more personal. "I'm telling you, it's not safe here anymore." Her father's voice was harsh, the stress in his words sharp and biting. "We can't keep pretending like everything's okay. The town's changing, Liza. People are getting desperate." Liza's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, Dad?" Her father turned, his face tight with frustration. I'm talking about the Wheelers. And the Smiths. Everyone's looking over their shoulder now, Liza. What happened to kindness? What happened to looking out for each other? It's all gone. People are holding on to what little they have, and if someone tries to take it, they won't think twice about turning on you. Liza's stomach churned. The Wheelers? The Smiths? She couldn't understand. How had things changed so quickly? Her mother, usually the calming presence in their home, spoke up softly, but there was no comfort in her words. Your father's right. We're not the only ones feeling it. People are acting different, like there's this tension building in the air. Everyone's on edge. Liza's mind raced. She thought about the Wheelers, about how she'd given them cookies, about how grateful they had seemed. How could they be part of whatever was happening now? That night, Liza couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the words of her parents echoing in her mind. Desperation, fear, people turning on each other. The next morning, the tension reached a breaking point. Liza was walking to the store when she saw Mr. Wheeler across the street. He was standing at his mailbox, a furious look on his face, his hands trembling as he held a letter in his hand. She took a few steps closer, unsure if she should speak to him, but before she could say anything, he shouted toward his house. Damn it, Carol. I told you we shouldn't have trusted them. Liza froze, her breath catching in her throat. Mr. Wheeler was usually so composed, so polite, but today his voice was full of anger and fear. She watched as he stormed back into his house, slamming the door behind him. Her curiosity gnawed at her, but she didn't approach. Something felt wrong, very wrong. Later that day, she learned that the Wheelers' house had been broken into. Nothing valuable had been stolen, but the damage was enough to shake the entire neighborhood. Windows shattered, furniture overturned, and a strange message had been left on the wall in red paint. Trust no one. Liza felt a cold chill run through her. This wasn't the same neighborhood anymore. Something dark was creeping in, and no one seemed safe. The news spread quickly, and soon it was clear that the entire town was on edge. People locked their doors more frequently, kept to themselves, and the once innocent neighborhood felt like a ticking time bomb. Liza could feel the shift, but she didn't know where to turn. The kindness she tried to share with the Wheelers now felt like a naive act, a moment of weakness in a world that was quickly unraveling. She had hoped that a small act could spark something greater, could bring people together. Instead, it seemed like it had only drawn attention to the cracks in the foundation of her world. That night, Liza overheard her father talking to someone on the phone, his voice low and urgent. We need to leave. We can't stay here anymore. It's getting dangerous. If we don't go now, it'll be too late. Liza felt a knot tighten in her chest. Her parents were making plans to leave. But where would they go? What had happened to the place that once felt like home? The next day, Liza decided to confront Mr. Wheeler. She had to know what had really happened. She couldn't stand the silence any longer. When she knocked on his door, he answered with a grim expression, his eyes shadowed with fear. Liza, you shouldn't be here, he said, his voice tight. I need to know what happened, she said, her voice shaking slightly. What's going on in this town? Mr. Wheeler hesitated before he finally spoke. It's not just about the break-in. People are losing their minds, Liza. They're afraid. Fear makes people do crazy things. The world's changing, and not for the better. What happened to you, your kindness? That's not the way it works here anymore. If you're not careful, that will be the thing that gets you hurt. Liza recoiled, stunned by his words. It was like a door had been opened to a world she hadn't been prepared to see. A world where kindness wasn't enough. Where fear and distrust ruled, and people were more likely to hurt you than help you. As she turned to leave, Mr. Wheeler called out to her. You can't fix this, Liza. Not with cookies, not with kind words. The world's broken, and people are too scared to even try anymore. The weight of his words hung in the air as Liza walked back home. The world outside felt colder, darker, more dangerous than ever before. And in the distance, she could swear she heard the faint sound of footsteps following her. But when she turned around, no one was there. The fear was real. The tension in the air, so thick it could suffocate you, was real. Something had shifted, and Liza didn't know if there was any going back.